Today, obviously we are on number 4 of 5 blue zones. Today we're talking about Okinawa, Japan, which, for me personally is definitely of the 5 blue zones, the one with which I identify the least, just in terms of diet. I think a lot of it is because a good number of the kind of Asian food ingredients that you need to make some of the foods that are popular there, you have to go to a specialty market. So it's just not as easy for most of us to get those ingredients unless we go to those types of markets on a regular basis. That said, I did find some really great looking recipes while kind of researching for this PowerPoint, for this presentation. And they're not all overly complicated. As you'll see, there's some relatively simple ingredients, some that are not so simple or easy to get a hold of, but there are certainly lessons we can all learn from Okinawa to incorporate into our lives. So, okay, oops, sorry. Okay, so Okinawa, where is it? So it's actually quite far south of Tokyo. It's closer to Taiwan than it is to mainland Japan. And it's got about 1.3, 1.4. It's been a while since I've seen a population update, but somewhere between 1.3 and 1.5 million people. And it is the smallest of Japan's main islands. It is also, as I'm sure a lot of you know, I had to include this because of who we are as a company, but it is a critical strategic location for the U.S. Armed Forces, which has unfortunately resulted in some fairly bad press over the years. But it is what it is, I suppose. So the USAF presence continues to be strong there, which is not necessarily a bad thing for the economy and tourism, but sometimes those, as we know very well, those cultural clashes can lead to some issues. And then one more kind of interesting factoid, just relevant to us, is that most of the elderly population speaks a specific Okinawan language. I'm not really sure how to pronounce that, Uchinaguchi. But some of the younger generations speak a little bit of it, but so it's not going to be a language that dies off completely anytime soon, but it's definitely used predominantly by the elderly population. So how does Okinawa compare to kind of the other blue zones, the rest of the world? Well, first and foremost, this is a pretty impressive number. Okinawa has 5 times as many centenarians as the rest of Japan, which is pretty impressive, which boils down to about 34.7 centenarians for every 100,000 people. If you just look at that number, that percentage, it doesn't really seem like that many. But then, stop and think, like, how many people over the age of 100 do you know? Both of my grandmothers lived to be quite old, but they still 394 when they both died, and they were, that was old. So if you think about how many centenarians you know or have come across, met personally, aside from the people that you see on like the Today Show, I think they still do that, the like Smuckers jam birthdays, but so it is actually quite an impressive number. In Okinawa, of all the blue zones, it has the greatest number of disability-free years. So for men, the average number of disability-free years is 72.3. For women, that's even higher at 77.7. So, what that means is, number of years living really just with a pretty healthy life without any major health issues or physical disabilities or anything like that, which is also a pretty impressive number, considering that that's more or less, I think the male, I'm not sure what the U.S. lifespans are right now, or life expectancies are right now, but I suspect it's somewhere around that number, and that's just disability-free years in Okinawa, not life expectancy. And then 2 kind of interesting and somewhat unique approaches that the Okinawan population embraces, that's a little bit different than a lot of the Western world, certainly different than the US, is that their focus is almost entirely on disease prevention rather than treatment. People do get sick, of course. We're human, stuff happens. There are things that are not really preventable. But their primary focus is on preventing basically preventing the body from having the chance to develop these diseases. So that is really how they kind of lead their lives. So it's almost a little bit more of like a cup is half full rather than cup is half empty kind of mentality. And then they focus more on social and environmental aging instead of biological aging, which is not really that much of a surprise given how long a lot of Okinawans live. But what we'll talk about here is how central like a strong social network is to Okinawans, how much they rely on the environment around them. Gardening, I'll talk about this in a moment, but gardening is a huge thing in Okinawa. So they're not really focused on, next year is my 80th birthday. In the US, we tend to focus a lot on the numbers. Some of them for better, everybody wants to turn 21, right, in the US. And then when you turn, 40 used to be kind of the big one. It's kind of getting pushed back now as our life expectancy does increase a little bit in this country, but they don't really focus as much on the numbers. They're focused more on how they feel, how they're interacting with their environment and the people around them. Now, compared to the numbers compared to the U.S. I found a couple of different, there was kind of a range of numbers, so I took a little bit of a conservative approach here. So keep in mind that these numbers were a little bit lower than some other studies that I found, but compared to the population in the United States, Okinawans have at minimum a fifth of the rate of cardiovascular disease, roughly a quarter of the rate of breast and prostate cancers, also a couple of other cancers, but those were the two primary ones that I found, and then about a third of the rate of dementia. Again, there were other studies for which the numbers were greater. The difference between the Western world in particular and Okinawa was even bigger, but even conservatively, those are some pretty astounding numbers. One study in particular that I read about that had been going on since, I think it was like 1972. It was kind of considered, I think it was called like the Okinawa study or something like that. But it was kind of considered the experts, like the forerunner of research on why Okinawans tend to live longer and healthier. So they studied 800 Okinawan centenarians. Certainly the number started bigger than that, or the number of participants started bigger than that, but ultimately it was 800 Okinawan centenarians. And you hear a couple of takeaways that are pretty interesting and pretty indicative of why Okinawa is a blue zone. First and foremost, compared to any other blue zone and really a lot of other places in the world, the Japanese keep very meticulous records. So in somewhat of a departure from some of the other blue zones, I'm thinking of specifically like on the Nicoyan Peninsula, where record keeping was at best a dubious proposition. The Japanese keep absolutely meticulous records. So there's very little margin for error in terms of knowing exactly how many centenarians there are at any given point in time in Okinawa. So when I'm giving you these statistics, you can rely on the numbers. Another kind of uniqueness is that the elderly Okinawans, they tend to be, really healthy. We've talked about this with the other blue zones, how it's not just about living longer lifespans, it's about living healthier in older age. So the Okinawans, they're lean people in general. They have a high energy level, and there's just not a lot of disease. Another takeaway was that quite often what they found was that there seemed to be some kind of genetic component where siblings would live to very similar old ages. If the siblings did relocate to another part of the world, which should happen I don't know how often, but did happen in within this study, the benefits, their health degenerated. So there does appear to be some kind of genetic component. So if one sibling lives to 100, there's a good chance that the other sibling will live to a similar age. And then I think a lot of us have probably heard about this mentality, the hara hachibu, which is the idea of eating until you're 80% full and then stopping and letting yourself kind of sit. That's a great approach just in general, because maybe if you let yourself get really hungry, who among us hasn't just shoveled food in and just eaten until we're really just stuffed? Or, I'm thinking of course, like Thanksgiving, certain holidays in the US where it's almost a sport to see how much you can eat. So eating until you're 80% full, of course, that's not a scientific number, but we're all smart people, so you can tell, when you start feeling a little bit full, you're no longer, like, you look at the food and you're no longer completely starving, and then just stopping. So this is partly about eating slower, enjoying and thinking about what you're eating, and also not always feeling like you have to clear your plate. What this does is not only do you feel better, feeling really stuffed. I mean, look, I love food as much as the next person, but feeling really, really full is not a good feeling. And I always regret if I do feel like that. But it's also ultimately leading to fewer calories consumed, which of course goes into that, the leanness of the population. These centenarians also had fewer free radicals, which damage your cells, damage all of your systems, than the centenarians in any other part of the world. So, free radicals cause inflammation, which is also a primary lead into a lot of diseases. So they're kind of starting with a much better base than a lot of other populations. By and large, their arteries were clean, healthy. They had low bad cholesterol, low LDL cholesterol. Bone density was decreasing at slower rates, particularly in women. So it's evident that they're getting enough vitamin D, calcium in their diets. And then women go through natural menopause with few complications, which obviously a lot of us, if you're younger or you're a man, of course, you're not really thinking about that. But if, this can be an incredibly difficult thing for women to go through. And there's quite a bit of evidence that soy plays into this. So this goes into the kind of healthier women. Another thing which I didn't put on the PowerPoint is that the Okinawan women actually tend to live even longer than any of the other blue zones. So if we're, as females, maybe we should think about it. Now, what do they eat? So it's a pretty simple diet, to be honest. They do a lot of stir-fried vegetables. Vegetarianism is very common in Okinawa. They do eat some meat. Usually it's pork or fish if they're going to eat meat, but it's a very small part of their diets. It is, as all of the other blue zone diets, it is a plant-based diet. So you see a lot of stir-fried vegetables using various spices and herbs, garlic, ginger, turmeric, all sorts of different flavor opportunities, which is, of course, a big plate of stir-fried vegetables. It's a filling meal, and it's also very low on the calories. They eat a lot of soy. Now, soy is somewhat controversial in its most processed form. There's a lot of literature out there, specifically in kind of the US and the Western world, about how too much soy has been linked to certain types of cancer, and it's not always good to eat a lot of soy. Well, the thing about the Okinawan soy, and they eat it in a lot of different forms. They eat it in tofu. They eat a lot of edamame. Miso soup is something that most Okinawans have with almost every meal. They make it themselves. So it's actually higher in, I believe, protein. It's much less processed because, they're making it right there in their village, taking it home and eating it. So minimal processing. But good soy has been shown to lower your risk of heart disease, helps reduce that LDL cholesterol. And then again, for women, it's tremendously beneficial. It helps keep that hormonal balance in check. one of the most interesting parts of the Okinawan diet is that purple and orange sweet potatoes are huge. And you'll see the breakdown of you'll see that pie chart here in a few moments, and you'll be probably surprised by how much exactly these sweet potatoes play into the Okinawan diet. But, you know, it's a big thing. So most Okinawans are eating these at least once a day, if not more often. They also do eat quite a few beans, not, of course, as many as Nicoya or some other areas of the world, but the beans are a good source of protein for them. And then a lot of fresh herbs, turmeric, as I mentioned, ginger, mugwort, garlic. They grow their own quite often, and they use them quite liberally in both tea and in their cooking. And then another very unique part of their diet is Goya. I've never had it myself. I've heard interesting things about it, but basically it's a bitter melon. It looks kind of like a cucumber with spikes, but it is absolutely packed with antioxidants. It's got like multiple times more antioxidants than blueberries, which are kind of considered, at least in the US, like a superfruit, and which, it also helps to lower blood sugar, keeps that insulin in check. Now, so here's the pie chart. Check that out. 67% sweet potatoes. Now, why are they so popular? Why are they such a formidable staple in their diets? A big part of that is really just a practicality, a reason for practicality. As an island, Okinawa sees its fair share of tsunamis, bad storms, and because sweet potatoes, they grow underground, they are very hardy, and they are one of the few foods that consistently can survive those tsunamis, those bad storms. You can grow them in abundance, and they're cheap. So Okinawa is not necessarily a hugely affluent area, or it's not a hugely affluent island in certain areas. So this is a great food that really anybody can obtain and cook quite easily. It's also high in B vitamins, also high in C vitamins, very high in potassium, and as I mentioned, has a complete abundance of antioxidants. As I mentioned already, vegetarianism is quite prevalent in the Okinawan culture, and they do a lot of soups with noodles or with tofu, sometimes with fish, more often than not, only vegetables. It's called dashi. There are recipes for that in this lovely cookbook, which sits on my table at all times, and it's pretty easy. There are multiple different varieties of it, but this acts as basically the base for all of the soups. And then if you notice, so depending on where you look, but generally speaking, most Okinawans eat less than 1% to 2% of fish. I think a lot of people, when they think of Asian cuisine, they assume that it's very heavy in seafood, right? But the reality is, at least in Okinawa, is that they eat very little fish, even less meat. And when they do eat meat, it's going to be pork. And very little dairy and eggs. They'll have occasionally eggs with breakfast, but those, again, play pretty minimally into their diets. They don't really drink much coffee. It's more of a tea culture. And they do drink some alcohol. It's not something that's looked down upon in the Okinawan culture, but it doesn't play, it's maybe one drink every once in a while. It's not something that comes into their diets very often. Now, in terms of lifestyle choices, let me look at the time. So there are a couple of unique parts of the Okinawan culture. So we had talked about, when we talked about Ikaria last week with Greece, that sense of purpose. There is, in the Okinawan culture, having this, I don't want to butcher the pronunciation, but ikigai, it's a reason for being, a purpose. Okinawans have a very strong sense of just being, of what they're supposed to be doing. It's not, generally speaking, some lofty, I need to wake up every morning and, and change the world. It's not anything usually as lofty as a desire to change the world completely, but it's just, they just get up and they're driven. They're just driven to live their lives, to live their lives with their friends and family, and to make their local environment and community better, which leads to the moais, which are committed social circles. Again, the social network is huge in Okinawa. And then Yumaru is a spirit of mutual aid. So there's a real sense of commonality and kind of, it takes a village kind of mentality in Okinawa. So, a lot of people don't have a whole lot of money. For example, instead of going to a bank to try to get a loan, somebody who, a farmer who is perhaps struggling or needs some extra funds, his community will rally around him and make sure that he's taken care of, as opposed to going to the official channels. So those social circles are really strong, really bring everybody together. It's almost kind of a spiritual connection, as described in all these books, and then this whole spirit of mutual aid, which is pretty fantastic. Definitely leads to a sense of well-being. You do something good for somebody else, you feel better about yourself. Somebody does something nice for you, you feel better about them, about yourself. It's a pay it forward kind of mentality that can really have tremendous benefits. And then, excuse me, as I mentioned earlier, most Okinawans maintain a medicinal garden. They grow a lot of herbs, many of which can be used in teas, can be used as kind of natural herbal medicines. So not only are they growing these herbs that they can use in their cooking and natural medicines, but they're also out in their gardens a lot, which is, it's not an aggressive form of exercise certainly, but it is kind of a natural, easy way to get some exercise, also to get that vitamin D just being outside. And then they're very active walkers. You don't see a lot of running and biking and purposeful exercise, but they do walk a lot. It's just, again, it's that naturally active lifestyle that we've seen in pretty much all of the other blue zones so far. So what lessons can we learn? I've still got one or two more slides, but does anybody have any thoughts? Oh, by the way, this is the Goya, that bitter fruit, that bitter melon I was talking about. And of course, a nice tofu salad. I know a lot of people, I'm a vegetarian myself, and a lot of people will tell me, I can't do tofu. It's just the texture or the taste. But tofu is one of those foods that really picks up. How it tastes is really largely dependent on what you put with it, what kind of sauce you use. So it can be an enormously versatile food if you cook it right and mix it with the right ingredients. So does anybody, especially most of you have attended at least a couple of the other Blue Zone webinars. Are there any specific ideas from Okinawa that you're seeing that you're like kind of a light bulb moment? So maybe I should start doing that, or maybe I'd like to try cooking with that. Is anybody inspired?
What's the benefits of the edamame? That one kind of stuck out to me.
So edamame, it's soy. So again, soy, it's been shown to lower bad cholesterol, help with heart health, and for women, it's kind of helps with like the hormone regulation. But yeah, edamame is great, right? Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Has anybody thought about that idea of having a purpose in life since we last talked about it? I'm going to have to send out some quizzes for you all. What, Lindsay?
Said I'm still looking for it.
Still looking for it. Okay, fair enough. You don't have to find it as long as you have kind of a purposeful, forward motion every day, right? I think there are a lot of good recipes in this cookbook. So I've tried to find the purple sweet potato. I've seen it at Trader Joe's. I didn't really know what to do with it. And I'm sure they have it at like Whole Foods, but I would like to try cooking with that a little bit. I used to eat a lot more tofu, so I'm going to try a few new recipes with that. I'm going to probably stay away from the Goya just because I think it's hard to find, and bitter and fruit don't sound great to me. But there certainly are some pretty easy things that we can do. You know, even not the purple sweet potatoes, regular sweet potatoes are a very, very healthy addition to your diet. So now a sample recipe. So like I said, there were quite a few very good looking recipes in the cookbook. But this one kind of stuck out to me just because it's so easy. So, you know, you can get any kind of like Japanese style noodles, rice noodles, whatever the case may be. You can get those at any grocery store. A little bit of sesame oil. If you've not cooked with sesame oil before, it's got a pretty strong flavor, so you don't need a lot of it. 1 cup of tofu, kind of, if you do cook with tofu, you want to make sure that you pat it dry with paper towels, drain it and then pat it dry, get that excess moisture out of it, cut it into some cubes, and then dice up some garlic, scallions, whatever extra vegetables you want to add to it. You know, cook the noodles. They usually take like 2 or 3 minutes to cook. Saute everything else and then just throw it all together. So easy, healthy, looks good, right? And filling. So think about giving that one a try. But so just to go back to these purple sweet potatoes, because when I saw that 67%, I was like, that can't be right. But that's, you know, that's huge. They're called EMO. Like I said, they are supercharged with these antioxidants that are fantastic for anti-aging. And they're also low on the glycemic load, which helps control your blood sugar. And they're complex carbs. So you want to always focus on complex carbohydrates as opposed to simple carbs, like, you know, white bread, white pasta, simple. Now, I didn't include the recipe specifically, but if you want to make them like kind of mashed potatoes, you just steam them, boil them, and mash them with a little bit of coconut milk. They do taste a little bit sweeter than your average sweet potato. I've been told. I think I've had them like once in my life, but supposedly quite good. And they, I mean, who doesn't want a big plate of purple food, you know, for dinner? But and then one other thing I'll mention, and it's 3 o'clock, is that, so Okinawa is so far, so I've done 4 of 5 blue zones. Okinawa is sadly the only one that looks like it might be on its way out as a blue zone. And the reason for that is that as I mentioned, it's a critical station for the U.S. Armed Forces. Bringing this population of expats and military has brought spam into Okinawa, and it is now the largest consumer of spam, which has been identified by the World Health Organization as having a similar damaging effect on the body as smoking. So, you know, there's been a real kind of backslide in Okinawa recently, just in terms of diet. They're eating a lot more white rice now than they used to. They're eating a lot of spam, and there's more obesity. Obesity has kind of skyrocketed just, you know, even in the last like 10 years or so. So there are some changes happening that are not good. Hopefully they can kind of, you know, stop that backward slide and regain the perspective. I mean, certainly it depends where you are on the island. But, you know, just to mention, because something that would be interesting to see in a few years if you go to look at what the 5 blue zones are, and perhaps Okinawa has been replaced by somewhere else. So time will tell. But that is it.